Hello and good evening to everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar, Q&A with Dr. Noel Rose. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Katie, and assisting me is Laura, who will be answering all your questions in the chat. And of course, our featured guest speaker, Dr. Rose. A few notes before we begin. You don't have to take any notes. We will be sending all of the material to you who registered in the upcoming days. And as far as the chat goes, please submit your questions, but please be aware that we might not have time to get to them, and that Dr. Rose, we can't offer any individual medical advice. So we're going to try to keep it more research-based. But if you do have other questions, please don't hesitate to email us arda@arda.org. All right, so to our guest speaker, he has a very distinguished career in autoimmunology, including several degrees from Yale University, the University of Pennsylvania, the State University of New York. He is also of a few honorary doctorates from, I'm not quite sure how to say them, but several universities in Italy. And then he's also has done extensive work and served in the field. He's currently with the Department of Pathology at Brigham and Women's Hospital and at Harvard Medical School. Has previously been the professor in the chair of the Department of Immunology and Infectious Diseases, and professor of pathology and director of immunopathology and microbiology. Oh, I believe that's a typo. My apologies. And then he was also the founding director of Johns Hopkins, one of the founding directors of Johns Hopkins Center for Autoimmune Disease Research. Some of his service has included work with the World Health Organization and the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences, chair of the NIH and the Autoimmune Disease Coordinating Committee, and then a fellow at the American Association for the Advancement of Science for the College of American Pathologists, the American Academy of Microbiology, and the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, an honorary member of the American Society of Microbiology. He is also a prolific writer, including the co-editor of the classic textbook, The Autoimmune Diseases, over 180 articles in peer-reviewed journals, 22 books that he has edited or co-edited, and 27 journals, to which he has served as an editorial board member. And with that, I will leave it to Dr. Rose to include anything that I might have missed and to start his presentation.
Well, you didn't miss much, and you might have added a few things as you went. So good evening. First, I guess the classical question is, can you hear me? And if you can't hear me, I don't know how you would know you don't hear me, but unless...
Please let us know in the chat if you can't hear us.
Okay, fine. So I'm assuming that there is an audience out there, because I hate to give a talk and then find out there was no one listening, but that has happened. So let's talk about autoimmunity and autoimmune disease, and I always like to start by clarifying a few terms. And I understand that those of you out there in the wild world can see some slides, so I'm going to be talking from these slides. If that's not right, again, please let me know. I'd like to begin a little bit before the first slide, which is what is autoimmunity, by just adding immunity itself, because I think these days everybody really knows what autoimmunity is. It is the body's physiological, that is, normal system for handling invaders, mostly infectious invaders. And we know all about that, because we know that if we don't have immunity, we are very prone to infections. And in fact, the disease we call AIDS is due to, of course, the HIV virus, but it's not the virus that kills, it's the infection that comes with it. So we need an immunity all the time to protect us against the many, many bacteria and viruses and so forth that are around us. And the number of possible invaders is almost endless. And new ones are coming along all the time. So there's always a new SIDS or a new AIDS, or even things, we're worried about things coming from Mars, things that never existed on Earth. And yet our immune system can spot them, it can recognize them, and it can cause the body to develop this protective, this physiologic response we call immunity. Well, that's something we've known for a long time. But what finally became clear to those of us who've been interested in this phenomenon is, how could we have a system that's so smart that it recognizes any organism, even new ones that never existed before, and not recognize our own bodies, not respond to our own bodies? How in the world does the immune system do that? Well, the immune system that reacts with our own bodies is what we've defined on the slide as an immune response to normal antigens. Antigens are what the immune system sees, antigens of the host, that's you and me. So why don't we develop antibodies or an immune response to antigens of ourselves? And that puzzled immunologists for many years after immunology became a science in the late 1900s. And in fact, there were a few rare examples where the body did respond to self, and those seemed to be special organs, the brain, the eye, and the testis, which were immunologically separated because it's disadvantageous to have them the site of an inflammatory response. And so there were those exceptions where, in fact, the body did react to self, but that was it. And when I started in this business, which I would have to say is now about 70 years ago, we were all taught in medical school that's what it is. I mean, you had to accept that as dogma. We just don't respond to ourselves. There's no such thing as autoimmunity, because it would be silly. Why would you want to respond to your own body? Well, it took us half a century to really begin to understand that. And the answer is we do have autoimmunity. We do respond to normal antigens of self. And you and I do it all the time. But it doesn't do us any harm. And the reason it doesn't do us any harm is that it is a very carefully regulated physiological system. It's very powerful, and powerful systems in the body have to be under control, have to be regulated carefully all the time. So autoimmunity is going on in all of us as I speak. And we have devices that keep this autoimmunity carefully regulated so it doesn't do any harm. But like anything else, it can go wrong, and it does go wrong, and that causes disease, and that's what we call autoimmune disease. So autoimmune disease is pathology, that's disease. Autoimmunity is normal in most of us most of the time, and that's probably as important a lesson as you can take away from this evening's discussion. So let's move on to the next slide. Do I say something or jump in hoops or move?
I got it. So autoimmune disease, the basics.
Okay, so that's, and I can move this. And so the next slide I have is called the top 10 autoimmune diseases in the United States. So if we're all together, that's what we have. And this is a bar graph. This is a graph with a lot of horizontal lines on it. And the longer the line, the more of that disease there is. So what you see is a list of diseases on the left side: Graves' disease, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, and so on. And there's a bar, and the longer the bar, the more disease there is. So this slide tells you two things anyway. First of all, we know now, which we didn't suspect 70 years ago, that there are many diseases that are caused by autoimmunity. There are many autoimmune diseases. They are all quite different because they occur in different parts of the body. Different organ systems are involved, and the disease itself presents dependent on the organ system in which they develop. So they can be clinically quite different, and that's a message that, again, I hope you'll take home with you, that the autoimmune diseases, while they all are caused by this out-of-control pathogenic autoimmunity, are all clinically very different, respond very differently, because they occur in different parts of the body. So you see there are many different diseases. Many of them you'll recognize. They're become famous now, but some you may not. And there's a bit of a moral there. So you'll see that the first three diseases on the top there, one is called Graves' disease, the second is rheumatoid arthritis, the third disease there is called Hashimoto's thyroiditis. There the bars are quite long, and that means there's a lot of them, and they're quite frequent. In fact, they're up in the order of 1,000 per 100,000, which is the way that doctors talk about a disease that's fairly common. And in fact, the first and third Graves' disease and Hashimoto's thyroiditis are both diseases of the thyroid gland that are really twins in a way, or non-identical twins. And put together, they are by far the most common autoimmune diseases we have. Rheumatoid arthritis is unfortunately also very common. So three of the diseases are quite common. The other lesson that we take from this slide is that the other diseases are rare, and individually they are easily overlooked and have been overlooked for many years. And it's only if we look at the autoimmune diseases collectively that we realize what a huge problem there is. So there are about 20 million people in the United States, or maybe a bit more than that, who have an autoimmune disease. A few of them, thyroid disease and rheumatoid arthritis, are fairly common. The other diseases, although if it's your disease, that's the disease you're interested in, but all of the autoimmune diseases come under the heading of rare. And believe me, in our society and government support, rare diseases don't get very far. So one of the lessons I hope we'll take away is that it's much better of us to, let's say, united we stand. If we think of the autoimmune diseases together, it's a big problem. If we think of them only individually, it's not such a big problem. Not that you shouldn't think of your own disease. I mean, that's obviously the first thing on your mind, but open up your mind a little bit to the thought that we need to think of other members of the autoimmune disease family. The other point that comes out is you'll notice the bars are in most cases are sort of a washed out orange color, I guess it is, and then a blue at the end. And of course, the blue are the males, and the decadent orange color there are the females. And most of the diseases occur much more in women than in men. And we'll talk about that, I think, in the next slide, if we can.
You got it.
Okay, there we are. So this is just one graph. This happens to be a bar graph that's done in the other way. There's no particular reason for that. It's just the into the spur of the moment sort of thing. And again, the red ones are the females and the blue ones are the males. And this tells you something that you really want to know quickly when you're studying disease, and that is that there is clearly a difference between males and females in the response. So way over there again on the left, you have diseases. You probably can't read them. It's a little hard for me to read them. Sjogren's syndrome and SLE is lupus and thyroid disease. These are diseases mainly of women. But then there are diseases that are much less biased towards women, and some that are pretty equal, and you even have a few over there at the end which are more common in males. So if you look at this, it tells you something very, very important, and that is that this difference is not due to a single factor. It's not just one thing that separates all the boys from the girls. There are multiple factors involved. And so this is a rather complex phenomenon and one which is very interesting, but very important, because looking at autoimmune diseases collectively, as we're doing this evening, they are much more common in women than in men. Almost 80% women overall, although there are exceptions, as you see, and the exceptions are instructive in this business. They're very much age-related also, and this shows us there's a very close interaction between the immune system, which is one of our regulatory systems of the body, and the endocrine system, which is another regulatory system. And it's these two acting together that determine who's most likely, who's at greatest risk to develop an autoimmune disease. So that, for example, autoimmune diseases in general can occur in any age. There's diseases from early childhood right through the extremes of age, but predominantly, most of the autoimmune diseases are diseases of young women, women in the childbearing years, women in the years when society places the greatest demands on women. They're starting their families, they're starting their careers, and autoimmune diseases are not just a disease of the patient, they are a disease of the entire family. Everybody in the family is affected by an autoimmune disease, and that's another reason why we must pay attention to them. So let's move on to the next slide. And what I have is a slide that shows a map of Europe.
Yes.
And you'll notice the colors are different, and the differences relate to the amount of disease occurring in that particular country, I guess in hundreds of thousands, if I can read that correctly. And without going through the great detail here, this tells us something else important about autoimmune disease. It's also important where you live. So autoimmune diseases in general are diseases of the temperate climates. They're more common in Northern Europe, in the Scandinavian countries, Britain, Iceland, than they are in Southern Europe. So that gives us a lot of information. In fact, too much information, because you can say, well, there's probably a genetic component. Indeed, we'll discuss that again in a moment. That's certainly true, but there are probably equally important environmental exposures, the amount of sunlight you get, things of that sort, which play a role in autoimmune disease. So who gets an autoimmune disease, who actually is most likely to develop, is dependent on, to some extent, on your sex and on where you were growing up. And by the way, if you move, you take on up to a certain age, you take on the disease susceptibility of the new place, and then beyond the age of 12, you keep your old one. So it also tells you that this is a disease which, in many cases, starts in childhood, but isn't expressed until later life. And we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, there's another lesson that we need to learn, and this is a graph with a wavy line in the middle. Now, this happens to be a graph that addresses a question that we've wondered about in this field for many years. We're seeing more and more autoimmune disease. Now, what does that tell us? Well, the first thing it should tell us is we're more aware of autoimmune disease. We are looking for it much more. We understand it much more. Patients are aware of it. They read about it. And so there is the ascertainment of disease. And what we see in this case, thyroid disease, is going up in the world. But now we know that in addition to ascertainment, it's a real increase. And this happens to be one type of study, which has been going on for many years, in which we look at a group of people, a city really, where the population is quite stable. And we can begin to record the number of cases over time, starting in the 1988, I guess, and going up just to a decade ago. It's still going on. And there's a real increase. In addition to ascertainment, there's a real increase. So this is disease of the thyroid. This is the autoimmune form of diabetes. And this is a test done in a different way. Most of the good studies on epidemiology of autoimmune disease, studies of this sort, are done in Scandinavia. One, because there's a lot of autoimmune disease in Scandinavia, as we said before, in Finland and Sweden. But also they have a single health system, and they track everybody, as we say, from the womb to the tomb. So that's another independent way of knowing that autoimmune diseases are really increasing. So we have a big problem. We have lots of patients with lots of diseases, most of which are considered rare diseases, very much neglected for that reason, but are increasing. And in fact, this curve actually shows they're increasing at an increased rate. All right, so that takes us to the next slide, which is kind of the causative tree of autoimmune disease. How does it occur? And there are really three, say, streams that make into the river that we call autoimmune disease. So autoimmune disease is there on the right, and there are three things that are involved. First of all, as we sort of hinted before, there is a genetic predisposition. That is, you inherit something from your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents, which makes you more likely, puts you at greater risk, in other words, of developing an autoimmune disease. And thanks to the Human Genome Project, we know a great deal now about the genes that gather in certain people and that make them more susceptible, more likely to develop an autoimmune disease, and even the type of autoimmune disease they may develop. So the interesting thing is that there is a predominant type of gene. It's a rather interesting kind of gene. It's the one that we know about because it's important in preventing transplantation of tissues like skin or kidney from one person to another. So that's called a transplantation antigen, and that's a big one. So that makes up the biggest amount of risk. And if you know somebody's genotype, that is the type of his genes that are on the transplantation part of the genome, the gene family, then you have a predictor of autoimmune disease. It's not enough, except in some rare instances, but it's a big help. Almost all of the other genes, interestingly, are small contributors. So you have one big one, And then you have lots of genes which contribute a small amount of susceptibility. And the more of those little tiny genes you get by bad luck, the more likely you are to develop an autoimmune disease, and even to some extent the type of autoimmune disease. And the interesting thing is that many of these little genes that contribute to the susceptibility to autoimmune disease are well known to immunologists because we already knew they were immunoregulatory genes. They are genes that are involved in the process of regulating the immune response, something we mentioned a little earlier. So that's part of the susceptibility. And if you look over the number of autoimmune diseases, you see that that makes up something in the order of a third of the risk. It's quite variable. It goes from maybe 5% of the risk to 45% of the risk, but it's usually a little less than half of the risk. And we know that certainly from animal studies, but we know that from humans because we compare the susceptibility of autoimmune co-occurrence in the same family where there are identical twins versus non-identical twins. And we easily see that there's much more in the identical twins, that is the same genes, than non-identical twins who differ. Even though they're twins, they're as different as brothers and sisters. So that tells us a big part of the story, and that's an important part of the story, which we'll come back to in a moment. The second thing there is the endocrine effect, and we know about that because of what we were saying previously about the difference between males and females. Now that's an area of very active study. We would know a lot more if we understood that, but that's probably involved in gene expression. It probably is determined by enzymes that we know are important in expression of genes, so-called epigenetic traits. And they make up an unknown part of this, but as you can see, the effect on females versus males is a very real one, a very important one. And we obviously need to learn much more about this, but it means looking at two regulatory systems at the same time, so it's hard to study. The third one, the third factor, the third stream that makes up this river we call autoimmune disease is environmental. And that's the majority of it. And here we have the least knowledge because it's very difficult to study in humans. In order to study it, you really have to have groups of people, usually large groups of people, who are very similar to each other but differ in an environmental exposure. And that's not so easy to do. So we will do things like study patients who are receiving a drug, and we'll know that the same drug may cause an autoimmune disease, let's say an autoimmune heart disease in one patient, but not in other patients. So there's a gene that's responsible for the heart disease susceptibility in some people. And so we have some factors of that sort. We have some food exposures that perhaps we'll get to a little later that may suggest there's an environmental factor there. So it could be intake of sorts. It could be exposures to toxic materials. It could be just a large number of things. But one thing that we do know, at least in a few cases with solid information, is infection. So one of the many environmental factors that we need to be interested in autoimmune disease and that could trigger an autoimmune disease in a genetically susceptible person is infection. Okay, so that having been said, what does that tell us that's really important in our lives? And this is a somewhat complicated story, but I think it can be understood very simply. And that is, the process, at least for most autoimmune diseases, is a long-term process. It goes, as you see at the bottom in months or even years. It probably starts in early childhood. It starts obviously with the genetic predisposition, which is already there, and may involve an infection during childhood, an exposure during childhood, something that could happen in Sweden, but not in Italy. Maybe the amount of sun a child gets, the vitamin D. There's a fruitful area of investigation. But there are warning signs, and I mentioned one of them, and that is these genes that tell us something. If we know that, and we can put that together with the earliest signs that an autoimmune process is underway, which we can see by the production of antibody, then we might know that we're at an early stage of autoimmunity getting out of control and going over the boundaries to autoimmune disease. And then we get a pre-disease state and finally the clinical disease. And this diagram could be used for virtually any autoimmune disease on the list. So we think at the moment that many of the autoimmune diseases anyway have a long past history, and that's important to us because that gives us the opportunity to do what we really want to do in this disease, and that is, as you see at the bottom, primary prevention. I think if we go to the next slide, yes, we have the way all this really works out. So maybe I'll read that because it's a little hard to read on the slide, but it says the major goal for all of us today is to understand that all of these autoimmune diseases, diverse as they are in their anatomical location and their clinical manifestation, are related because they have the same etiology, that is the same cause. They are all caused by the train of autoimmunity, the train of events that we call autoimmunity, going from harmless autoimmunity to pathogenic autoimmune disease. And in order to develop treatments, and more important perhaps, in order to develop preventions or preventive interventions, we need to treat the cause of the disease, not just the symptoms. We like to use the example, if you have dandelions in your lawn, it's nice to cut them down whenever you see them, but it's better to go down and snip out the roots. And so we want to get to the roots of autoimmune disease. So the symptoms are late. When you have the disease symptomatology, that's really too late to do a lot. So we end up treating the disease, ameliorating the symptoms, but we don't cure an autoimmune disease, and we certainly have very rare examples where we can get enough information and enough knowledge to prevent the disease. So we need to get on the train at the very early beginning. So let's just summarize what we've been talking about here. Whoops, and then we can talk about questions. So autoimmune disease is a large and it's a growing problem in the United States. Autoimmune disease is a problem because it can occur virtually in any site of the body. Almost any system has its autoimmune disease, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. They are diseases which share their basic mechanisms, basically genetics, that is heredity, and environment. But they're clinically very different, treated by different doctors in different ways, and very much separated in the way they're researched and supported. And I think the lesson we need to learn from all of this that takes priority is that autoimmune disease is present in, at least in many forms of autoimmune disease, before the disease is clinically recognized. Okay, that's my spiel, and I understand that there are some questions.
Yes, and thank you so much for all of that. It's Very, very informative. And as you said, we will be taking questions now. We received so many already that we sort of have a list. We combined those that were a bit repetitive. The first one was, why does autoimmunity happen? But I believe you answered that pretty thoroughly. But Dr. Rose, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's what I tried to talk about. So we've learned now to a great extent how they happen. So the question is, what can we do about it? That's the big issue.
Yes.
Okay, let's go on.
All right. So the next one, what do you see as the biggest obstacles to treatments or cures for autoimmune diseases?
Again, that's a little bit what I covered, but let's repeat it because it's so critical. The biggest obstacle, and again, you can't make perfectly general statements. Every autoimmune disease is a little different from every other one, but nevertheless, it's certainly the predominant view that the biggest obstacle we have is that we don't treat the disease before the train wreck occurs. So when we see a patient, the patient's sick. I mean, good patients, patients in good health don't come in to see their doctor, or certainly don't ask about an autoimmune disease. And by that time, the damage is irreversible, and we're left with treating the symptoms of the disease. And we've gotten pretty good at that. I mean, I have to tell you that in these years, in the years since the 50s when this field came about, diseases like lupus, which was a fatal disease when I was a medical student, we were told if a patient had lupus, he wouldn't live 5 years. Now patients can live a long life and in many autoimmune diseases in quite functional health. But the disease is almost always still there. There are only rare exceptions where autoimmune diseases seem to disappear. So by and large, it's a lifelong disease. We're treating the symptoms of the disease, but we do not cure the disease.
Right. Well, and that is a great segue into the next question. And that is, what do you envision as a cure for autoimmune disease? Something like safe and effective treatment for a continuous remission, preventative measures, disease-specific measures, your general thoughts on what a cure would look like.
Okay, so it's sort of all of the above, I guess, in this case. What we really need is, we need two things. We need a reliable prediction, a reliable way of knowing that someone is on the train, or even just waiting at the station for the train. And so at a very early stage, when it should be easy to reverse the disease. And in fact, in experimental animals, we can do that. So we know that to the extent that the animals are a good guide, and they usually are, excuse me, this can be, you can really predict someone with a fair degree of certainty that the disease is going to occur, but that may be as long as 20 years later. But we need something else, particularly if we're talking about treating diseases in the early years of life. And that is, we need what I call a benign intervention. We need a way of treating a healthy child, because the child coming to the office is in good health, but in which we have a strong enough indication from the genetics, from the known exposures, from whatever other data we can put together, that we would dare to intervene. And it has to be an intervention that by itself is not going to do more harm than good, because we don't treat healthy people unless we have very, very sure knowledge that the advantage is much greater than the risk. So those are the two things we're looking for. Much, much better prediction at an earlier age and a benign intervention. And then I think the way forward is going to be to use a benign intervention. And just to say a word about that, there may be another question about that, but another problem we have in autoimmune disease is that we assume that the disease itself is due to an immune response to something in the body, to an antigen in the body. Remember that from the first couple of slides. And if we want to prevent the disease in animals, what we try to do is find the antigen and administer the antigen in a way that will curb the immune response. And for that, we need to know the antigen. Well, strangely enough, after all these years, there aren't very many autoimmune diseases where we actually know the substance in the host, in the patient, which is the cause of the damaging autoimmune response. So that's another requirement that has to be on the list. Okay.
Wow, thank you. All right, the next question. We've gotten a few people requesting and having an interest in hearing more about recent research results. So is there anything out there that's, new and exciting?
Yeah, well, that takes me right to where I was, because that's, I think, one of the areas where the research is going right now. A big area of the research is to know precisely what it is in the body that is the target of the autoimmune response, of the damaging autoimmune response. Now, again, those are things you can do in animals, but doing them in humans turns out to be very different. And we just don't have very many good examples where that's possible. Then the other thing we need to do, and we are doing a little better, is to say, all right, if we know what the antigen is, the other thing we'd like to know is what part of the immune system is going haywire, which is the part of the system which is out of control, and can we intervene and control the disease that way? That is, without having to know the exact antigen, but at least know what the important pathologic mechanism is. And interestingly enough, that part of the research is going on at great rate at the moment for a very interesting reason, and that is an interest in cancer immunology. What do I mean by that? Well, if you think about it, cancer is the other side of the coin from autoimmune disease. In autoimmune disease, the patient is producing an immune response to himself or herself, to one's own body. In cancer, the disease is progressing because the patient is not producing an immune response. And oncology in the past decade, a little more, has made enormous strides in developing treatments based on circumventing the various ways the immune system has to keep itself under control, and to allow the immune system to act on tumors, which are predominantly self, or very, very close to self, very, very similar to self. So while they are, that's something that immunologists have been interested in for a long time, the cancer doctors call these checkpoints, and are now studying them with great vigor and with great success. In fact, just the last Nobel Prize is exactly for this kind of work. And putting these two fields together is really moving the whole field of autoimmune disease forward at a great rate. I must say that, and deservedly so, cancer gets a lot more research money than autoimmune disease. It's a disease that most members of Congress are worried about. So it gets good support. And so that's been quite successful. And there are several types of cancers which not too many years ago were considered recalcitrant to treatment, now can be treated and possibly cured. And to be able to say that about cancers is pretty rare. So we're seeing a huge step forward in cancer immunology, and autoimmunity is the other side of the coin, and I think that's beginning to move on, or is moving on more rapidly as the knowledge of how the immune system is normally regulated comes to the surface. So I think that's another area of research that's very important. The third one, by the way, is environment, and I wish we had more opportunity to do that. That's the kind of research which is so expensive that the government only can do most of that, because it's research depending on large numbers of people studying them over long periods of time. So that's probably the third part that's not progressing as it should. Okay, I guess. Well, let me say one more word, as long as we might have another minute, because I happen to be at the moment very much interested in the one environmental thing in autoimmune disease that we know is important is infection, and we're interested particularly because that's the one disease, the one autoimmune disease, which has been almost eliminated in the Western countries, because we know now that the disease we call rheumatic fever, or more particularly the rheumatic heart disease, is an autoimmune response which is generated by exposure to a strep infection, a beta hemolytic strep that causes most of the throat infections in youngsters. And if we can recognize these people who are susceptible, because they are genetically susceptible apparently, and prevent repeated strep infections with appropriate antibiotic treatment, they won't develop rheumatic fever. So that is another important approach, and one we think is a very practical one, where if we could find that there is an infection hidden somewhere in the many factors that contribute to autoimmune disease, and is an important factor, and could treat the infection, then maybe we could prevent the autoimmune disease that way.
Wow, that's great news. So our next question, and again, you talked about this a little bit more, or a little bit before, but do you have any more to say as far as the connection of autoimmune diseases within families?
Yes, okay, a very important topic on which we've learned a great deal, but have a great deal more to learn. So as I indicated, we know that the risk of developing an autoimmune disease depends on multiple genes. It's not, most of them aren't due to a single gene or even a couple of genes, but it's probably due to 20 or 30 different genes contributing. Where would you find that? Where would that occur? Well, it's most likely that you would be sharing a lot of these genes with members of your family. Now, I'm excluding the big one, this transplantation gene, because we can test for that and we can match people on that. But the real question is, what about all these other genes, most of which contribute small amounts? And that's difficult to study because you need to look at a lot of individuals. But we start with members of a family. We know that they're more likely to share many of these genes. And so that's an important area of research. And it turns out that co-occurrence of autoimmune disease is quite striking. It's quite interesting, and one of the early things that clinicians began to notice. So they found that if they have a patient with thyroid disease, for example, this is a good example, the chance of another member of the family mother, father, uncle, aunt, grandmother, having thyroid disease is quite high. And so if you look at an individual, you just take large numbers of individuals and say, what is the risk that I will develop an autoimmune disease? If I have a family history, it's about 20%, which is pretty high. So there is a real risk if you have one autoimmune disease of developing a second. And that's, even nowadays, that's very important information, because it means that you should be looking for it. It doesn't mean that you should be doing something about it. You don't treat a disease until we get the kind of information we need. You don't treat a disease before you diagnose the disease. But you should be on the lookout for it, particularly in members of the family. And so if you have a family history of autoimmune disease, that's an added risk, and one that a patient should be aware of, and her physician, the young members of the family, the children, should be aware of.
Mm-hmm. And that actually leads us right into our next question. Is there a percentage of individuals who have one autoimmune disease who get a second? Do we know that prevalence rate?
Yeah, we were saying that. If you have one autoimmune disease, you also have another one. You also have a greater risk of another autoimmune disease. So that's also clustering. We call that clustering. And there's clustering with other members of the family, but there's also clustering within the same individual. And so if you have one autoimmune disease, you have a significant risk of a second autoimmune disease. And interestingly, there are affinities within the autoimmune disease family. So if you have autoimmune thyroid disease, you have a greater disease of affecting the islet cells, the insulin-producing cells, and you will often find a young person or even an older person with both of those diseases, or sometimes a third endocrine disease going on at the same time. So they tend to be a little bit diseases within the broad, the field within the broad field of autoimmune diseases that tend to cluster. But the short answer to the question is that yes, one autoimmune disease puts you at risk for a second or even a third, and that's something, again, a patient should be aware of and her doctor should be looking for.
Absolutely. Okay. And then, so on to our next question. Does medical training exist specifically for autoimmunology?
Good question. It's a little difficult. There is no such thing in our medical system as an autoimmunologist. We don't have people we have only very rare people who make their living studying autoimmune disease, because diseases are treated by specialists in each field, and each disease is different, and they have to be treated by a specialist. So we don't have anybody who is just concentrating on autoimmune disease. And that's something that ARDA has been very interested in all these years. Where does a patient go who has more than one autoimmune disease going on? And they've been very active in trying to see if there's a type of organization that could look at patients with different kinds of autoimmune disease and treat them together, because too many patients have to go from one type of doctor to another type of doctor to another type of doctor, and that's certainly far from ideal. But unfortunately, we don't have a type of physician, a recognized specialty in medicine for autoimmune diseases broadly.
At least not yet.
At least not yet.
Okay, so we're running close to our time, but I want to get in one last question because we hear it so often here at ARDA. what is the research like regarding diet and nutrition in relation to autoimmune disease?
Yeah. Well, there are two parts to that answer, as usual. One is that the immune system is a physiological system, and like all physiological systems, it needs to be well-fed. And well-fed means that it gets a good, balanced diet. So the predominant autoimmune disease treatment, a dietary treatment for autoimmune disease, is a good, balanced diet of the type the Department of Agriculture espouses and puts out. So you could do no better than look at their very good literature and see that lots of fruits and vegetables and maybe a little less red meat and so on. All the things that I think our mothers are teaching us are true for autoimmune disease. So for most autoimmune diseases, that's the case. There are a few instances where there is a dietary factor that's involved in the autoimmune disease, and gluten is the villain in this case, and that's received a lot of attention because that causes a type of inflammatory inflammation called celiac disease, and for patients who are diagnosed with celiac disease, gluten-free diet is a very effective way of treating the disease. Interestingly, the diet, which is now available quite widely in supermarkets, is also used by many people who have other types of disease who don't have celiac disease, and they seem to get a benefit from it too. But at least I don't know why, and I'm not sure that anybody really understands that. But there are just a few instances where there's a dietary factor that does actually play a causative role in the disease, and as we can identify those and get rid of them in those patients who are genetically predisposed to the disease, we can either alleviate the disease or maybe permanently get rid of the disease.
All very, very good information. And I just want to start to wrap things up. For everyone listening, please visit our website for more information. We have a wealth of resources on our website, resources, tips, statistics, how you can get involved, opportunities for clinical trials and advocacy opportunities, all sorts of good stuff. And I also want to take a second to thank you, Dr. Rose, for everything you've done for ARDA. He's been with ARDA since the very beginning, and for everything he's done in his own career field as far as, research and getting the word out about autoimmune diseases and all the complexities that go along with them. And then, again, all the notes and everything will be sent to you at a later date. And please don't hesitate to email us, arda@arda.org, with any other questions, feedback, input, suggestions. We are listening. And with that, I will wish you a good evening. And Dr. Rose, if you have any closing remarks, the floor is all yours.
I wish good health to all and happy holidays.
Hear, hear.